Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this morning's event, Driving the Sustainable Finance Agenda, How COVID-19 Could Catalyze Progress. We're so pleased you can be with us. With international attention fully focused on pandemic-related issues, some fear that the global climate agenda could actually lose momentum as policymakers put all their efforts into the fight against COVID-19. However, the forceful international response, including most recently a number of remarkable debt relief initiatives, also illustrates that we can work collaboratively to support a more sustainable growth model. Coming up, we've got panels featuring industry views on how the private sector can take the initiative. And we'll also hear from leading policymakers on how the agenda may change in light of the current pandemic. We'll cover issues including an assessment of climate and broader ESG risks, disclosure, and scaling up funding for the Sustainable Development Goals. So an exciting morning ahead. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. We encourage you to submit questions for our panelists in both events through the Q&A prompt at the bottom of your screen. And please note that if you're joining by phone, you'll only be able to listen to the webinar. You won't be able to submit questions. And maybe one day all platforms will unite, but we're not quite there yet. And finally, this event is on the record and members of the press are on the line. To get us started, I am absolutely delighted. We are honored to be joined by Frank Elderson, who is chairman of the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, or the NGFS as we all know it. Frank, we are delighted that you could be with us today. And I wanted to start off with a broad question, just to get things started. As this pandemic fight continues and the crisis response continues, changing the way we live and work, why do you think it's important that we keep our focus on sustainable finance?
Make it overshadows at the very moment everything. There is, of course, terrible human suffering, and it causes, as we all know, a severe impact on our economies. So it is really of the utmost importance. We should not lose track of the very urgent crisis that we look at today. But that doesn't mean that we should forget about the other crisis that was already unfolding and that's there. It's not, unfortunately, that the post-corona world will all of a sudden be a world without a climate crisis. That will still be there. So we need to not lose sight of that. And I think at the current tipping point, stimulus packages that are being concocted all over the world should not simply be used to rebuild the pre-corona economy, but we should identify opportunities to lay the groundwork for a more sustainable and a greener post-corona economy. So a way to put that would be to say that we need to make sure that the recovery out of this crisis is as green as possible. And to put it even more bluntly, if we are going, to kickstart the world economy by putting trillions of dollars in the economy, are we putting those trillions in coal or in windmills? And if we are going to massively invest, and we are going to, are we going to massively invest in the economy of yesterday, of the economy of the tomorrow? Are we going to return to our brown past, or are we going to give a boost to a green future? And this, I think, is the main point I would like to make here. That I think that it is the moment that all actors in the financial world, be it policymakers, companies, financial institutions, central banks, supervisors, we should all think about ways that how that can be done. And to just give you a very clear example of something that was already done, over a decade ago, in 2009, then President Obama granted large sums of state aid to General Motors, but on the condition that GM accelerated the development of electric cars. Also, when we think of fiscal stimulus packages to green the economy, there could be conditions in there. I'm very glad also, and later today I saw that Martin Spols of the European Commission will be speaking as well. The importance of the Green Deal being put in place as a way of making sure, again, that if we structure our recovery, that it be as green as possible, that our resurrection is going to be a sustainable resurrection.
You raise a really good point with all of the fiscal response and indeed the debt relief that has been being talked about extensively the past couple of weeks. Many have been thinking, okay, let's set aside some of that, let's put in some conditionality, let's make sure that some of this funding or debt relief is also used to sort of alleviate and mitigation and adaptation efforts against climate change. So it's a really important point. So how does all this feed into the NGFS policy agenda? What is next for the NGFS, and how are you implementing these plans in the virtual world we live in now?
Right. Well, the NGFS, of course, has to deal with the fact that we are all now working from home, etc. But it doesn't hold us back. And in the coming months, we are planning to release a number of documents. And I will just give you some of the examples. First of all, a guide for supervisors on integrating climate-related and environmental risk into prudential supervision. Second, a status report on financial institutions' definitions and practices regarding environmental-related risk quantification and mitigation. And third, a set of reference scenarios capturing physical and transition risks. And then these scenarios are going to be published alongside a guide on scenario analysis. Again, we are continuing our work. Work streams have been productive. These various publications are coming up. We were going to be delivering those in a physical meeting with all our members, the 65 by now, 12 observers, in a meeting in Bangkok. But unfortunately, that had to be cancelled. But we will think of a virtual way of bringing this to the world.
Now, it's reassuring to hear the sense that all of these important issues that the NGFS has been working on, including around kind of climate scenarios and work that the financial sector has been watching very closely, is continuing. So good to hear. So at this time when we are all living so separately, how is the NGFS collaborating with other international organizations, and how are you making sure there's international harmonization? There's a lot of talk about declining globalization and concerns about that.
Right. Well, I think that's an excellent question and a very urgent one. Well, as you know, the NGFS is a network of central banks and supervisors. We refer to ourselves as a coalition of the willing. As such, this network is committed to sharing best practices and raising awareness among its members and the financial community about the financial risks linked to environmental and climate risk. So, two clear examples, concrete examples as to how we do that is a guide we published last year on sustainable responsible investment for central banks portfolio management. So here we try to stimulate, our members to learn from each other in terms of us as central banks, of course, having our own investments and how can we do that in a sustainable manner. And the second example is the guide I was just referring to that we are working on and publishing soon on how supervisors can address climate-related financial risk in their work. Now, I also mentioned we are now 65 members, 12 observers, some of the recently joined ones, the Central Bank of Brazil, the Baltic States, the Central Bank of Cambodia. And I think that, the very fact that we have such a worldwide membership on 5 continents, both developed and emerging the economies, I think in and of itself contributes to an international approach. Now, then we also work very closely together with the international standard setting bodies. Now, the recommendations of the NGFS are non-binding, as we are a coalition of the willing, as I said. But although we don't formally set standards, we do lead by example. We do publish recommendations. We identify good practices. And what we see in practice is that, these recommendations are actually being read very carefully around the world. And they're actually also being acted upon. So de facto, I think that, we create practices that could be seen as informal guidelines, if you like, and although they fall short of formal standards, it is actually a very fine line. Now, that having been said, we do work very closely together with the BAL Committee, with the IAIS, with IOSCO, who are all within our broader observer and stakeholder community, and also vice versa. So the Secretariat of the NGFS is also very much involved with the secretariats of these various standard setting bodies. And we welcome that they are actually doing work within their realm. And actually, there is now also a task force on climate-related risk under the BAL Committee, which I co-chair. So that is also a way of making sure that we mutually enhance our work and that we don't duplicate our work.
Yes, I think that's a topic of great interest. I think that the new task force that you referenced, the BAL Committee Task Force on non-financial climate risks. Also, you co-chair that with Kevin Styro, being the New York Fed, from the New York Fed. So that brings the U.S. into the equation. So it's a very, very welcome development, I think.
That's right.
So let's think maybe for a minute about the role of the financial sector in all of this, right? Because climate change is a global issue. Climate change is equally impacting public and private sector. Private sector efforts, private sector funding are very much needed in this whole initiative. What role do you see for the private financial sector, and how can they best collaborate with supervisors and central banks in thinking about some of these risks and addressing them?
Right. Well, first of all, I really want to express my great appreciation for the steps that have been taken and are being taken by financial institutions on sustainable finance around the globe. To just name one example, but it's an important one, and that is, the many financial institutions having created a partnership for carbon accounting financials, PCAF, which is a partnership committed to measure and disclose the greenhouse gas emissions of their portfolios. But there are many other examples. So that's one. Two, we are certainly not there yet. More needs to be done in terms of identification and mitigation of climate-related and environmental risks. And there, I really see a role for the financial sector to continue and to scale up their actions. Again, despite the fact, of course, that our very urgent attention now naturally goes out to the COVID pandemic. But also in response to this crisis, and I would even say especially in response to this crisis, that financial institutions should have a long-term perspective. There will be a post-corona world, and in taking that long-term perspective, climate and environmental related risks need to be taken into account. And then, third point, coming back to what I said earlier, I think that this can be seen, and maybe you deem this too optimistic a way of looking at the world, but we must be optimistic because the challenges that we face are so daunting. So forgive me for being optimistic. But if you see how the world has been able to galvanize into massive action over the last months, weeks, and days, in face of the clear and present danger that the COVID-19, embodies, it kind of like makes me think that if we are able to transmit the urgency of the climate crisis, and I think we are there, then mankind should be able to live up to that challenge as well. So that is maybe an optimistic note on which I would like to end and say that that might stimulate ourselves in thinking that we can actually bring about this green recovery, and that way can solve two problems at the same time.
Thank you very much, Frank. A welcome message indeed, and I don't think you need to apologize for the optimism. I think we all very much welcome it at this difficult time. So it's been very reassuring to hear your perspectives on the importance of the sustainable finance agenda, and indeed how the pandemic could ultimately bring sustainability considerations even more into the mainstream. So we really appreciate your time today and wish you all the best.
Thanks a lot. My pleasure, Sonia.
Thank you for being with us.